isn't a single Star Wars opinion where I'm going to be like, you're wrong. Because, like, you have the right to feel however you so want. Like, you can't watch these movies a wrong way and have me be like, nope, sorry. Like, I'll disagree with you. I might argue my point a little bit. I might try to see where you're coming from. But I'm not going to really begrudge you for your... Man, I sure do love the Star Wars Holiday Special. Get out. Alright, so as the title suggests, these are going to be my unpopular opinions. You don't have to agree with them, but these are what I think I feel differently in the Star Wars universe versus a lot of other fans. Now, if you agree, great. If you don't, let me know why. So going in no particular order here, but starting out nice and controversial here, Rey Skywalker, completely valid. Now, there's a numerous amount of reasons I think that The Rise of Skywalker, in general, I think maybe it's unpopular that I really like The Rise of Skywalker, but I think in terms of this Rey Skywalker thing, how the scene plays out, a lot of people don't like it. They think it's a little bit cheesy and shoehorned, and they also think it doesn't fit Rey's narrative. But I have to beg to differ in terms from both just like a Star Wars perspective as well as why it fits Rey. Now, Rey spends the greater part of the sequel trilogy sort of trying to find herself. It's a very, common trope for many characters, not just in Star Wars, but in general. A coming of age. She grows with the saga. She's probably one of the few characters in the sequel trilogy that we actually see kind of get some development. And in terms of that, we start with Rey from Jakku in the beginning, and she doesn't have, she doesn't know who her parents are, and she's waiting for somebody. She's waiting. And there's something, that she's waiting for, and that's her parents. We don't know who they are. She feels like she's nobody and she's helpless, and she wants nothing to do with being a greater part of the Star Wars universe. She doesn't want to be the hero. She has no desire or interest to be the hero. And it's kind of thrust upon her. Many heroes have greatness thrust upon them, and Rey is that character. And then in The Last Jedi, we sort of have her facing this, and they push her parentage sort of at the forefront, and she still feels those lingering levels of guilt, and Kylo is kind of trying to push this narrative of her being nobody. You're no one, you have no place in this story. And for her, she still kind of feels a little bit like a medium, like she's going to Luke because she wants Luke to be the one to save the day. She still doesn't see herself as the hero. She kind of sees herself as like a pawn to go get the hero, and she's fine with that. And then she can go back to Jakku and she can go wait for her parents. And in The Last Jedi, she has to come to terms with the fact that they're not coming back. They're dead, they're nobody, that's it. And then Rey sort of has to go from there. And then in The Rise of Skywalker, we get the position of Rey kind of feeling this growing darkness inside of her, and she's wondering where it's coming from. It's revealed to be a parentage thing. She thinks that that's why she feels that way, that her family line, the Palpatines, are the ones that are inspiring this growing evil in her, or so she thinks. And then Luke points out that there's more to people than blood, and this is so true, because we see that in Luke and we see that in Leia. It's while some people can be more prone to, darker tendencies, and they can have different wiring and everything, ultimately, it's the choices you make and choosing to be good, and some people have to choose very hard to be good. I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying more people are more predispositioned towards that, but for Rey, she has a lot to fight against, and that's the big thing. So I think for her, choosing to be good, choosing a name that she affiliates with good, even though she never met Anakin Skywalker and all the things he did, choosing to be good, though, is being a Skywalker, and for her to embody that as well, because Ben can't, because Ben Solo is dead. He's the last living biological member of the Skywalker lineage, as well as the Organa lineage and everything so forth, and the Solos too. 3 different lineages die with Ben Solo. That's so dark. But with Rey, it makes sense that she leans that way because she is choosing her family, because there's more to you than blood. There's also the argument of, like, did you really expect her to go around as a Palpatine? Everybody knows Palpatine and all the dangers and sadness that he's inflicted upon the universe. You're not going to expect, Hitler's ancestors to go by Hitler. because Palpatine is a space Hitler. This whole story is about orphans and people who choose different names. Star Wars is full of it. Tons of people who pick different names. Padme Amidala. Amidala is not her last name. That is the name she chose when she became Queen of Naboo. Her name is Padme Naberrie. That is her last name. She chose Amidala, and that's her choice. That's what we call her. And then Obi-Wan Kenobi chooses Ben. He takes up the name Ben later. So much so, it becomes so impactful that that's what they name Ben Solo after. Obi-Wan Kenobi chooses Ben, and then they call him Ben Kenobi from thenceforth. All the Sith choose different names. Caleb Dune takes up the name Kanan Jarrus, and Rey takes Rey Skywalker. Moving on. No, sorry fangirls, Ben Solo should not have lived. And I know this is only popular amongst certain sectors of the fan base, but it is a strong opinion that when people saw The Rise of Skywalker, they felt like Ben Solo deserved to live. And my argument against this is primarily because it would have felt extremely cheap if Ben Solo got to live. Because then you kind of have to flip the script and be like, Darth Vader didn't get to live, and he didn't get to live out his life. I know he made those choices, but so did Kylo Ren. And one of my issues with the novels and the comics is I do think it emboldens him a little too much, and it kind of takes the responsibility away from him completely, because that doesn't make an interesting character. But at face value, at the movies and even with the novels in mind, I do think, he destroys a lot, and he kills a lot of people, and he does a lot of bad things. Even as Kylo Ren, the dark side is, taking over him, all that stuff. I don't think that Ben has enough time to redeem himself, in a sense. He turns good too late in the movie for it to have felt okay for him to get to kind of walk back to the Resistance base hand in hand with Rey. And for one thing, Poe or Finn would have shot him on the spot. Because that's what you do. They'd be like, Rey, Doc. He sort of has to make that sacrifice because that is him solidifying his good place. Do I think he probably should have shown up as a Force ghost in the end? Yes, because I think showing him on the light side with his mom and his uncle, I think that would have been a little bit more in tune with Star Wars, especially since we see Anakin do it at the end of Return of the Jedi, Am I bummed that the biological Skywalker lineage is dead? Yes. But Han and Leia should have just had another kid. That's such a bummer. Speaking of Leia, flying Leia. Valid. Kanan Jarrus does it in Rebels. No one says anything. But when Leia goes all Superman, everybody has a fit. Here's the thing. Leia is the daughter of the Chosen One. Luke can go out there and do all this weird space projection stuff, and everyone's like, that's just the Force. It's a different way of using the Force. But Leia is in a heightened fight or flight moment where she is just pure instinct and pure at one with the Force, and it's so hard for people to believe that she could just pull herself to the door. What? We've already established that space kind of works differently in Star Wars. I know that there's people were kind of comparing it to the Guardians of the Galaxy scene where Peter has to wear that helmet but his body is fine. It's like that. Space is interacted differently in Star Wars. The droids can sort of just float around in there and not freeze over. And there's even scenes in the Clone Wars of people kind of crawling out of their ships. They need masks and stuff to breathe, but it's still different, and you don't freeze to death instantly like you normally would in space. There's also explosions in space in Star Wars, which isn't scientifically possible either. So before we start, pointing our fingers at one thing, let's just accept in a way that the Force is the Force. It's weird. There's just some aspects of it that you just need to accept. It's a freak thing. It's kind of like when mothers lift cars off their babies, in those freak miracle stories of strength, because it's pure adrenaline, it's pure power, and that's all it is. And Leia deserves to be OP. This one's gonna get me so much hate, I can already tell. George Lucas would not have made a better sequel trilogy. I could just sense all of you turning off the video right now. He would not have made a better sequel trilogy. Don't think he would have made a worse one. I think it would have been different for sure from what we got. I still think we would have ended up with 10 Death Stars. I can't look at this man and how he did the original trilogy, and he repeated his actions then with the second Death Star in Return of the Jedi, and consciously believed that he wasn't going to do something like that again. And also, anyone who thinks he would have acknowledged the EU is crazy, because he wouldn't have at all. He just would have like overwritten it, just like Disney, but in a lot less official way. He just would have said his little comment about how there's their canon and then there's his canon, basically. George never, he allowed the EU to exist, but he never really was like, yeah, that's real, that's canon. Like, he didn't abide it, they had to abide him. Which makes sense, he created Star Wars, but I don't think he would have been out here creating Mara Jade or anything like that. His original idea for all 9 movies, pretty much the basis of it was they were going to have, you know, originally Luke's sister was not supposed to be Leia, which I covered in a video before, and the sequel trilogy was basically going to be like him finding his sister, which would have been an interesting concept on paper. I think we still would have ended up with a lot of repetitive themes. That, or we would have ended up with a lot more political stuff, which I wouldn't have said no to. But if it would have been in the same vein as the prequel trilogy, again, don't think it would have been that great. I think George suffers intensely from lack of collaboration as a creator. I think, you know, the reason the original trilogy is so great is that it was made by so many brilliant minds. Started with him, of course, and I give him all the credit for that. I really do. I feel like I'm particularly hard on George Lucas, and I have immense respect for him and the world he created. I think he is, you know, a genius in that respect. But he did what a lot of people kind of fall into the trap of with the prequel trilogy, and that was basically accepting zero help. And not that I think he'd make the same mistakes with the sequel trilogy, but if he had that same mindset of things going exactly how he wants them to go, Palpatine still would have risen. There's the thing. Palpatine was always coming back to life. Darth Maul coming back to life was George Lucas's idea. So people who like try to write the Clone Wars off on that, George Lucas still had involvement with the Clone Wars. He loved bringing people back to life. I feel like we would have saw more people popping back. Darth Vader probably would have popped back to some extent. I think we would have saw Force Ghosts of Hayden Christensen and Ewan McGregor probably if George Lucas was in charge. There are certain things I think he would have done that I definitely would have liked more, but I think from like a storytelling perspective, from dialogue, from casting, I just don't think he would have had it in him to personally make these movies better than what we got. I think it probably would have made more sense because it would have been the same person making 3 movies, but I don't think it would have been what people wanted it to be still. And also, it was a good move to turn the EU into Legends. Again, everybody who wasn't turning off on the last one is turning off on this one. So I really like the EU, now dubbed Legends. I think some of it is absolute garbage, but that's just me. And, you know, if you can't look at it from a critical standpoint and say, yeah, a good chunk of this makes absolutely no sense, then I don't think you're really reading it. And I think you're just reading the Zahn trilogy. And I think you're just paying attention to the things that are genuinely good about the EU, which of course there's plenty of it. There's so many talented writers involved with it. Some of the comic books, video games, and books are some of the greatest pieces of Star Wars literature. That is the truth. But you can't have those and not shed away you can't pick and choose what you want, basically, and say, this stuff is canon, but this isn't. It gets way too confusing. And what Disney was going to do, or whoever was going to buy Star Wars, because George was going to sell it to somebody, they were going to get rid of it. And George probably would have done it too, if he could. And like I said, if he was making new movies, he would have done the same exact thing to an extent. I think, but Disney was smart in the sense that they were like, we can have both. You can have your EU, now dubbed Legends, and it won't be affected or harmed or touched. You could have all those stories still, and we'll reprint them, we'll create a new banner under them. There's just a different canon timeline for those. Keep them, it's fine. They just won't really cross into the main canon, with like a few rare exceptions, like Thrawn. I do think Disney should have pulled from the EU more. I think there are certain concepts they should have taken, maybe not directly, like the whole Kylo Ren thing. He's sort of like Jason Solo, like that's kind of the idea behind him. But they should have taken like the twin dynamic, I think, and done that instead of Rey versus Kylo and the awkward romantic tension thing that people were forcing. I think that would have been a good idea. But I think in terms of a sales perspective and in terms of just a casual viewership, you can't expect people to have like understanding of hundreds and hundreds of comic books and books of lore before going to see these movies. They wanted them to be accessible, and on that level alone, I think that it's perfectly valid. They dumped the EU in favor of creating their own canon. And the Disney canon is super uniform, which I think is brilliant too. That's something that needed to happen. Rose Tico is not a bad character. She's not a well-written character, but she has a ton of potential. And I think that the thing with Rose is that her character arc had so much promise, in the sense that her sister, Paige, and that whole opening sequence of The Last Jedi had so much potential to be powerful when Paige sacrificed herself to destroy a dreadnought, and that just the visual of that, and then the holding of like the necklace, that just seemed like it was going to be some powerful stuff. And carrying that through the movie would have been really smart, and having Rose try to honor her sister and those that have fallen, because the thing with Star Wars is that it does that thing where it hones in on like 3 characters and that's your perspective. But this had the opportunity of showing you the losses that people endure on, you know, the small scale, and how that can resonate to real life too. And I think that doing that, instead of taking them on some random animal cruelty story arc and kind of being there as a distraction for Finn in favor of Rey, who was going off with Kylo, I think that would have been better. But they decided to sort of make like 3 different character arcs with Rose, and it just didn't feel like they completed any of them. So Rose is just very indignant, and I think it's a huge reach saying she's the worst character in Star Wars. There is like a large list of those before we even begin to get to Rose. But I do think she's a character that deserved to be explored a little more in The Rise of Skywalker. I definitely think they got a little scared. They also had absolutely no time for it. Did they need to introduce Zori? No, but I think Zori's time slot probably should have gone to Finn. And Rose, if they actually, you know, had the time and the resources to do that, I think they should have gone more into her character and given her more of a purpose that wasn't just trying to be a hero like her sister. She comes a little bit off as like a try-hard, and I don't blame her for trying hard. But you don't want her to seem that way. Clone Wars 2008 is better than Clone Wars 2002. I think on an aesthetic basis, I prefer Clone Wars 2002 in a lot of ways, but Clone Wars 2008 actually fleshes out characters and introduces plenty of new ones that just create so much depth in Star Wars. It puts the clones at center stage, but it feels right. It feels like a massive thing that just went unnoticed and untouched in the movies that really should have been. It makes Anakin likable, which is a mountain in and of itself. It gives him reasonable belief that the Jedi are wrong, and it also shows Palpatine working behind the scenes. Ahsoka Tano acts as a fulcrum of this too, and following her story and her character growth and development. It also does Mandalorians better than anything in the EU ever has, and that's the hill I will die on. And not to mention the fact that we get to see so many different villains and ways of the Force being used. There's magic, and it also connects Revenge of the Sith to the original trilogy, as well as Attack of the Clones to Revenge of the Sith in such big ways. And I can say that now that the show is finished. And last but not least, my final opinion, the Lego Star Wars video games are the best Star Wars video games. Again, I will die on that hill. I think that if you want to feel like you're having fun and playing around in the physical Star Wars universe, you want to be inserted there and have a good time and have the whole lightsaber thing. I'm not saying the combat is anything to die for, but just having a lightsaber and going ham with minimal consequences, that might make me sound like a Sith, but that's the dream, folks. What are some of your unpopular opinions in Star Wars? I know some of mine are probably hella controversial. Others maybe not. Who's to say? May the Force be with you guys. Have a great day.